Okay, this is Helen Thomas and the CDFM study group. Just to let you know, for those that are on the live session, that this session is being recorded. So be mindful of the things that you say if you don't want it being recorded. All right, so today what we're going to do is begin review of CDFM Module 1. But before I jump into it, I want to reiterate a few things. When you're studying for the CDFM exam, you look at the information as a whole, which means even though in the study group, I only focus on certain pages. Even if you go to the 5-day course, I've had people give me some feedback, and in the classes, they might give you certain areas to focus on. You cannot only focus on those areas. You have to make sure that you know the big picture, and then so you kind of start off big, you know the big picture of what's going on, and then you zoom into specific things that are happening in that process. Because on the exam, as you get these scenarios, you got to be able to visualize, okay, what are they talking about? So if you know what the big picture looks like, then once you start eliminating things, you'll be able to get to that particular answer and what needs to be done. Understood. Yes, ma'am. So as I start the review, I might start off going page by page, but I'm going to go through certain topics, and if that topic triggers something else, then I will speak on that information. So we started off Module 1 by looking at the historical background of how do we get to the process of the way the budget currently works. And so we looked at the federal budget process, and we understand that we started off, excuse me, with the Declaration of Independence. We went through ratification to the point where we have our U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution dictates a lot of the do's and don'ts of each of the branches of the federal government. So it provides general statutes. It tells us what Congress can do, the president, or the courts. And so part of that separation of powers, they gave us the 3 branches of government. What are the 3 branches of government? Legislative, executive, judicial. You learn them in that order because legislative directly correlates with Article 1. Executive, because it directly correlates with Article 2 of the Constitution, and the courts is the judicial courts in Article 3. So you want to learn them in that order. All right, so just checking the chat. All right, we're good. All right, so we got that. All right, so under Article 1, it lists the steps of the things that Congress is allowed to do, or the legislative branch. You need to know what right looks like, so once you get to a multiple choice type exam, you'll be able to insert, okay, is this a function of the president, function of Congress, who's doing all these things? And you will see under Article 1, there's a lot of things that Congress is allowed to do. If you notice, now that I'm in the review phase for you as you're studying, is you have to read through every single page, highlight what you think is important on that page, write notes on what you think is important. The next round, you go through the material, you focus on the highlights, you focus on the notes that you make. So when you get to the review and you know I have a date for the exam, I'm getting ready to take the exam, and you get to this review, you should be able to do what I'm doing. Look at the topic and just kind of regurgitate what you know about that topic. So that's all I'm doing. So on Article 1, it says the House of Representatives, they serve 2-year terms. Our senators serve 6-year terms. Congress can raise revenue, delineates the bills in the House of Representatives. The president is required to submit the budget within 10 days. That's all in there in Section 7. Section 8 says Congress can collect taxes. And Section 9 says I cannot take any money out of the Treasury unless an appropriation law is in place. So Article 1, Section 9 is the reason the government was shut down. If you don't have a budget in place, the Constitution says you cannot get any money out the Treasury. So Article 1, Section 9. So those are the functions of the legislative branch who makes the laws. Then the executive branch, or the president, executes the laws. What can the president do? Serves a 4-year term. President is a commander-in-chief of our military forces, conducts State of the Union address to notify the country of what their priorities are for the country, what success they've had over the past 2 years, or how often they do these particular addresses. And then the courts interprets the laws based on whatever law is there. Someone says, is this constitutional or unconstitutional? The courts will then go through and determine if it is or is not. Then we looked at the legislative process. We went through the basic definition of a bill, a general proposal of something that we want to become law. And then we have the joint resolution. Joint, saying the House and the Senate is involved. We want to make a change to the Constitution, for example. And both the House and the Senate say, yep, we want to make a change to the Constitution. Both the bill and the joint resolution has to go to the president for the president to sign for it to become a law. The concurrent resolution and simple resolution are actions that occur in the Congress. Concurrent meaning it's an action that's happening at the same time. Like when we talk about the POM and the budget, those are concurrent actions that happen in the House and the Senate. The same thing that happens at the same time. Simple resolution happens only in one or the other. Concurrent happens in both. The concurrent and the simple resolutions do not need to go to the president for the president to sign. Who can introduce the legislation? It is introduced by the president, a member of Congress, or a committee in Congress. Those are the 3 ways in which one of these legislation can be introduced. So if you want something to be law, it eventually has to go up to Congress, and one of your Congress members can get it submitted for it to become law and get voted on. So in the process of something becoming law, a bill is introduced. The bill has to be given to the House, then and the Senate. They have public hearings. That's your time for the individual to go in and to justify. Why do you want this to become law? What are the pros? What are the cons? Who does it involve? All of those things are answered in the consideration. And then they may have questions or disagreements from the Congress. You'll have the markups. Once you go back to correct the markups, you submit a clean bill. And then that clean bill goes back to the House and the Senate on their floor for review. Once that bill is passed by either the House or the Senate, the first one that passes it, the name of it changes to an engrossed bill. And at some point, the House has to vote on it and the Senate has to vote on that bill. Of course, you're going to have disagreements. So where they have the similarities, we don't need to discuss. If they have differences, then they have to come together in a conference committee. So I'm trying to make a story out of it. That's how you have to go through once you get to this point. So whenever the House and the Senate have a disagreement in how they're going to vote on a bill, they have to come together in a conference committee. It does not matter how many members they send from the House, how many members they send from the Senate, because they're voting as one body, but together they have to come up with one bill, because only one document can go to the president to sign to become law. So let me pause at this point. Do we have any questions on that? Okay, I don't hear any questions. We'll go ahead and move on. Okay. All right, thank you. No questions, no chat. All right, so when they come together in a conference committee, or it may be called the third chamber. Flip the page. And then once they vote on that, they make a decision, they make an agreement. We have that one bill that needs to go to the president for the president to sign. Then that bill is enrolled for the president's signature. And the clock begins. Once the bill is submitted to the president, I'm on page 1117 if you're trying to follow the story, then the president has several options of what he wants to do with the bill. He can approve it and sign it. He likes everything in the bill. He approves it and signs it. Or he can veto. He can say, you know what, I don't like portions of this bill. I'm going to veto it and send the whole document back to the drawing board, to the person that originated or the committee. Or unlike in the 1990s, we had the line item veto where the president was allowed to line out, to mark out portions of the bill he did not like, and then he could sign the bill, and the rest of the bill would become law, minus the stuff that they marked out. So it wasn't until 1996, line item veto, that the courts determined that this was unconstitutional. You can't do that. Because by the time Congress realizes, oh, this law was not approved because the president marked it out, then they were very highly upset all these years. It's just crazy that it took that long for something to be done. But you also have a couple options for the president once the bill comes. The president cannot sign the bill, but allow the bill to become law, or he can do nothing and it still does not become law. There's a few conditions that must be in place. Let me pause there. Ms. Tina, do you want me to ask questions for you to answer if you want to participate, or I can go through?
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I'm following along. It doesn't matter.
You're good? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm kind of used to going through, like if nobody's here, I still go through it like this. So, but if you want to participate, I can ask you questions also.
Matter of fact, since it's just you and I for
Yes,
right
ma'am.
now, I'll raise my hand if I have a question. That way you go on just like
outstanding.
what you described, because it's good actually how you're doing this. So
Right, right. Now it sounds more like a story than, okay, what are all these topics? Right, okay. So does not sign but allows something to become law. Now, how is that possible? You already told me the president has to sign it for it to become law, but now we got that catch-22 or that exception to the policy. He can get the document once it's enrolled and not sign it, and it still becomes law. The condition that must occur for that to happen is the president receives the bill, Congress is in session, and the president does nothing for 10 days. That bill will automatically become law. So I repeat, does not sign but allow it to become law only occurs if once the president receives the bill, Congress is in session, and the president does not reply within 10 days, that bill will automatically become law. Unlike a pocket veto, the president can do nothing and it still does not become law if Congress is adjourned. If Congress has gone home for the holidays and this bill is enrolled and shows up on his desk, he knows, okay, well, Congress is not in session. I don't have to look at it within 10 days and it's not going to become law. We can revisit that later. So that's called a pocket veto. Wait until Congress is not in session and then do nothing about it. So that's a basic general bill. And so now we're going to focus on the budget process. which flows a little different. Because remember, the budget comes from the president to Congress, back to the president to sign for it to become law. So budget formulation begins when Office of Management and Budget, OMB, issues guidance. So OMB works for the president. So let's go down the hierarchy. Congress has the Congressional Budget Office. Congress has GAO. Congress has, what else they have up there? The House and the Senate committees, budget committees, and all of those different committees. The president, the executive branch, has Office of Management and Budget to do all their resource management. The Department of Defense has the USD Comptroller. So the difference between Module 1, 3, and 2 is in Module 2, you're going to be looking at the different leaders in the DoD level that also is involved in this process. But for Module 1, you're not really looking at those guys. So you're mainly focusing on the budget folks, which is the USD Comptroller. So OMB issues guidance, sends it out to the organizations. The organization submits their budget based on that guidance and so forth. That's budget formulation. And they submit a budget estimate submission, the BES. All right, so what happens is the agencies like the Department of Defense submit their budget requests, submit their POM requests to OMB. At some point, OMB sits down with the Department of Defense, or the Secretary of Defense, and which is his representative is the USD Comptroller. Now we're talking budget. You know, it's not the commander that's going to these meetings. It's the person they designate to be in charge of that role. So OMB, USD Comptroller sits down during the fall review to go over their budget submission. But hey, this is what we want to submit to get included in the president's budget or the pres bud. OMB says, yeah, no, I don't like that. Mark it out. And then the final OMB document that says what they're going to put for the president's budget is called the OMB passback. That's what they're going to be submitting for the president to sign. That's the OMB passback. And so the OMB then, based on the president, submits to the president, yay, nay, they send it forward for Congress. Based on the law, the president, and I got to remember which law it was, the Budget and Accounting Act, I think is what it was, that says that the Congress had to submit, and now I'm thinking about it because we learned it last week and I got to remember what it was. It's gonna come back to me. Which law says that the president must submit the budget to Congress no later than the first Monday in February of the year prior to that fiscal year. Once the president submits the budget request to Congress, so series of events, president submits the budget to Congress, then Congress has 3 phases that they go through when they look at the budget. You still with me, Miss Tina?
I'm fine, ma'am. I'm fine.
Okay, all right, thank you. Because I don't want to give the pages, because at this point, I just want you to just feel the story. All right, so when Congress initially gets the president's budget, like when we submit the fiscal year 24 budget, which was submitted in February, okay, we're in February. So once they submit that budget, then these are the things that Congress is going to do with it. Congress is going through the budget resolution process, authorization process, appropriation process. Budget resolution occurs and is the responsibility of the House Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee. Remember, 2 sides of Congress. Let me flip that part so I can get caught up. And so remember the format. Everything that happens on the House side happens on the Senate side. So what they're doing now in the budget resolution process is they're determining internally in Congress what type of guidelines are we going to use when we look at the president's budget. What kind of things are we definitely not going to approve? They got to vote on that. What is the focus? What is the deficit? The debt ceiling? All of those questions are answered. You have the Congressional Budget Office that gives the data. Think of an accountant that pulls all the data, the prior year execution data, the prior year policies, guidances, all of that is provided by the CBO. And then the House Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee have to determine what are we going to do with the president's budget. And then if they have any differences in how they want to look at the budget, they come together to resolve those differences. The purpose of the third chamber is for them to resolve differences. If the Senate sends 5 members and the House of Representatives sends 1, it doesn't matter. It doesn't give either one an advantage because they're voting as one and one, and together they have to come up with one document, one agreement. And so they meet together to come up with those guidelines. Once they make the decision, that is a concurrent resolution process, a concurrent budget resolution, because it doesn't go to the president. That's just them working internally to say how they're going to view and rate the pres budget. So that's phase 1. And phase 2 is the authorization process. So think of the PALM process. Those programs. So the PALM happens in the authorization process. The House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee is responsible for the authorization process. What is the purpose of the authorization process? It is to authorize the programs that we are allowed to spend money on for the next fiscal year. Even if they talk about money and how much they think, the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee cannot give us money. They can talk about, yeah, we want to give $2 million for this aircraft or for this military construction project. Doesn't matter. So if you have a question that's comparing authorization law to appropriation law, just remember, we only get funding from appropriation law, which is the next one. So authorization, authorize the program, the category of things we are allowed to do in the upcoming fiscal year. And then the third phase of congressional action is the appropriation law. The House Appropriation Committee and the Senate Appropriation Committee. Actions occur the same. They are looking at the president's budget and they're determining which ones they're actually going to approve. Now, their action is independent in most cases from the Armed Services Committee, because the appropriators, yes, they can appropriate money for a program that the authorizers did not authorize. But it doesn't matter, because as long as they give us money and they put it in the language, in the law, it then becomes money that we can spend on that project, whatever it is that they say we can do. And so both the authorization and the appropriation process ends by going to the president for the president to sign for them to become law. So you have an authorization law, authorize the program, appropriation law provides the funding. But they're not equal. It doesn't mean, okay, this one authorizes this program, that the appropriators have to give us money for that program. Doesn't work that way. So once the appropriations have been approved, you have 12 appropriations. So you have 12 subcommittees that's responsible for each of those appropriations. And since this is a Department of Defense exam, we must understand that the defense-related appropriations are defense, military construction, veterans affairs, and energy and water development, because those are the three appropriations that provide funding to the Department of Defense. Agencies can appeal, of course, to Congress if they don't get what they want, but in most cases, we know it's a zero-sum game. Congress is going to tell you, stop doing something so you can do what you want to do, but you're only going to get the money that we gave you. And then what happens if we don't have an appropriation law in place by 1 October is often they enact a continuing resolution, which is a temporary appropriation law, a stopgap. We have to have an appropriation law or a temporary appropriation law in place in order to get money out of the Treasury based on Article 1, Section 9. I think it's like Clause 7. And so the continuing resolution, even though there's not a lot of information in the Module 1, you still need to know all the things associated with the CR, which is also covered in Module 3.1. No new start. You have to operate under the same rate of operation as you were operating under the prior year, the previous year. What else? Long as you follow the rules of the CR, and let's say a Department of Defense, then Congress comes back and lowers how much they want to give to the Department of Defense, then no, an ADA violation did not occur. You just have to adjust something else you're not going to be able to accomplish, some mission you're not going to be able to do, because you have to operate off of the funding that was approved. Then once Congress appropriates the funds, two things happen. The first thing that happened, which is legal, is the Treasury issuing the Treasury warrant, because the Treasury is getting notification that the law has been approved, has been signed, is enacted, and the law is what triggers the Treasury to be able to open the bank accounts. So the Treasury issues the Treasury warrant. And the second thing that happens on the other side, which is the administrative side, is the OMB apportionment process. How does that look? That looks like this. Once Congress appropriates the money, the agencies fills out an SF-132, and I got to make sure I don't say SF-182 because I was doing one earlier. The SF-132 is an apportionment document. So DOD, all the other departments, excuse me, feel like I got to sneeze in a little bit, but it won't come out. And then they have to submit their budget request. Hey, Congress appropriated the funds for the Department of Defense. This is my SF-132 requiring my funding. And so the SF-132 must be submitted to OMB within 10 days of Congress appropriating the funds. And then OMB has another 30 days to go ahead and issue the apportionment. Thank you. I couldn't get the sneeze out. It's one of those where the sneeze won't come out. So bear with me. I got my tissue just in case. And then quarterly, after that, for that fiscal year, every quarter, the Department of Defense must submit an SF-133, which is more of an execution data. When you look at this is what we gave you, this is what you plan to do, this is what you actually do, explain. So kind of no different than what we do at our level, but they actually have a formal process to do that on the SF-133. So again, two things happen once Congress appropriates the money. Treasury issues a Treasury warrant, and OMB begins the apportionment process. So even though OMB is not the one taking the first step, apportionment happens between OMB and the agencies. And we already talked about that. So when you have appropriations, oftentimes Congress you can have impoundment of funds where they said, okay, you might have asked for these funds 2 years ago. By the time we give it to you, you don't need it anymore. They can postpone those funds. So deferrals versus rescissions. You can defer the fund, postpone it until you actually need it, or rescission is where you cancel that appropriation funding because I need it over here, but you gave me the funds in this particular pocket and I don't need it there anymore. So OMB, Congress appropriated the funds, OMB apportions funds, and the Department of Defense issues allotments. That's the 3 A's. Appropriation, apportionment, allotment. So everybody that falls within the Department of Defense and under, we get allotment from that apportionment. And we commit, we obligate the funds, and then we outlay the funds, commonly known as disbursement. But for CDFM purposes, the proper terminology is outlays. An outlay simply means when the funds are removed from the Treasury to pay that bill. Because again, remember, the Treasury account is tied to that law, so we need a formal term, outlay, to explain that. And then once Congress appropriates the money, they give them out we get our allotments. Then we need to have an external auditing agency that ensures that we are following the rules and the responsibilities and use of those funds. And that external auditing agency that works directly for Congress is the Government Accountability Office, or the GAO. GAO works for Congress to make sure that the executive branch and everybody who uses that budget is following the rules that Congress has established. The leader of the GAO, his title is Comptroller General. So it's not on the page in front of me, but again, once I start talking GAO, you want to know what else do I know about the GAO? So Comptroller General. I also know about the GAO red, yellow, and green book, a stoplight. Red for appropriations. If I want to find out the most authoritative source of appropriations use, I go to the GAO Red Book. If I want to look up auditing, based on what the GAO says about auditing, I go to the GAO Yellow Book. If I want to know about internal control, likewise, I go to the GAO Green Book, red, yellow, green. And so we're going to look at the federal budget and expenses to kind of look at why things are the way they are and how we get funding, basically. So how does the government make money? That's revenue, money coming in. The government makes money in several ways, but the 2 biggest ways is, and you think about it, if you're middle class, like most of us, is they get us on taxes, individual income taxes. As I'm getting ready to do my taxes, and I'm like, oh my God, that's a lot of taxes I'm paying. It's like, I need to figure out how to cut these taxes. And then Social Security, Medicare, that they take out your paycheck, which is basically another tax, right? But they take that out to make money for the country. And so those are the big pocket. 50% individual income tax, 36% is Social Security and Medicare, which is the same people. We're paying the tax on this side, and then we're paying for Social Security and Medicare, and all of that funding is coming out from that individual's paycheck. So that's how the money comes in. You have other pockets like the corporations. They only pay like 7%. So kind of like, okay, I need to get me a corporation or excise tax or other. But the big pockets is what you want to focus on: individual income tax, Social Security, Medicare. And then now look at the bills that the government has to pay. So all the money they're taking from us, they have mandatory bills that they have to pay just like we do. We got certain bills like, okay, if you want to have a roof over your head, you better pay your rent, your mortgage, you better pay for your car. And then you have that other money, like, I want to go on vacation, I want to go out and eat. That's your discretionary money where you can play around with. So the government have something similar to that. Direct or mandatory bill. So of all the bills that the federal government has, 70%, did you hear me? 70% of all the bills that the government has to pay are mandatory bills. We call them must funds. So you got to pay people, those who get Social Security. They don't want to hear it. I need my Social Security check. I need my Medicare, right? I got to pay interest on the debt. So there's other things that we do with discretionary money. But I got to first pay for my mandatory bills. That's 70% off the top. And 30% is left to do everything else that the country needs to do. And oh, by the way, of that 30%, the Department of Defense gets about half of that. So what is left for the Department of State, the Department of Agriculture, all them other departments, they only get about 50%. All of them, they have to divide up amongst themselves. So if you notice when they start talking about cutting expenses, they often look at the Department of Defense first because we're spending most of the money. So almost, what is it? Actually right at like 50% or a little bit more than 50% because it's 15.3. So about 50% of the discretionary spending that we can change goes to the Department of Defense. And so now you understand the impact of how the funding is received, why things are the way they are, and why when you say, okay, why aren't we spending more on education? Or that's a big one for me because I'm like, yeah, if you go sit in some of these classes or how much they pay the teachers that's educating our children, it's ridiculous. But until our leaders do something about it, that won't change. So then we look at several regulations. Let me see if I can find the one that is still racking in my brain. I might stumble on it. CBO, empowerment, change fiscal year. All right. So the Budget and Accounting Act, there it is, the first one, right? Helps to read. So it's the 1921 Budget and Accounting Act that said the president must submit the budget to Congress no later than the first Monday in February. 1921 Budget and Accounting Act. That one was sticking in my brain there. All right, and we already talked about line item veto. All right, and it's only been not even an hour yet, so we're gonna keep rolling. All right, so understand that the mission of the Department of Defense is to support and defend the Constitution, to provide security for our country. So all the resources needs to be tailored to that mission. So if you have combatant commanders, those people that are deploying, they take priority because that's the mission of the Department of Defense. It's not us sitting at Fort Huachuca, Fort Eustis, Fort Bragg, or where we're sitting at. The focus is on people that are actually in active function of defending our country or our allies. And so the resources, the manpower, the equipment, all of that focus goes there because you don't have a whole lot. You got to make sure you manage it. So what you need to remember is all the forces is you also have the Coast Guard. And we often forget that the Coast Guard is also an armed force. The only difference is the Coast Guard does not fall under the Department of Defense. The Coast Guard falls under the Department of Homeland Security. And I must say, I just learned that when I started going through, so a few years ago when I started going through the CDFM material, I'm like, oh, I just assume all the military fell under the Department of Defense, but not. So let's not forget the Coast Guard. And so for manpower, the first priority for all resources, whether it's the budget, whether it's manpower, personnel, it goes to those combatant commands. PACOM, what they got, NORTHCOM, SOUTHCOM, all of those that have geographical regions of the map that they're responsible for, the resources are provided to them based on priority. And so operational command. And when you learn in module 2, you're going to learn that operational chain of command goes from, because remember, the commander in chief is the president. So operational chain of command runs from the president to the SecDef to these combatant commanders. And the resources flows that way also. I'm sorry about those, are just itching. And then you have the Joint Chief of Staff, which is military. Your president is a civilian, your SecDef is a civilian, and then you got military commanders. Well, you need somebody to translate to them. So you have the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, who's a military top guy that advises the president and the SecDef to get the information to those military generals, so they could talk the military lingo. So when manpower, you can sometimes use civilian personnel to fill certain positions when the military has to be pulled out. So here in module 1, you got introduced to, on one of the charts on page 128, the Future Year Defense Program, FYDP, FIDE. There are all kinds of ways people use those terms. But the Future Year Defense Program is a database that's used by the Department of Defense to keep track of all the missions, all the resources needed for those missions, and are used by the various services, Army, Navy, Air Force, whoever use it, because every function that's done by the Department of Defense falls under several, it's called force programs. Those programs that are approved by the appropriator, the authorizers, those are the functions of the SecDef. And so the FYDP database keeps track of all of that. You'll get more of that in module 2. Understand also with manpower is that the president, based on Title 10 U.S. Code 12304, the president is authorized to activate forces. In most cases, that's a function of Congress. Congress can declare war, determine who goes, and so forth. But under Title 10, that U.S. Code 12304, the president can do that also, but certain conditions must be met. So the president has the authority to activate reserve forces if you have a threat of weapon of mass destruction, a terrorist attack, or a threat of a terrorist attack. The president can automatically activate forces without going to Congress. But he's limited. They can only be called out for a year, 365 days. And the number total is he cannot call up no more than 200,000 from the selective reserve and the IRR, individual ready reserve. And of that 200,000, no more than 30,000 can be in the individual ready reserve. So, you know, we have different reserve pockets. And so the IRR, only 30,000 can be called up from there. So that's U.S. Code, let me read it correctly, 10 U.S. Code 12304. Try to say, every time you say it, repeat the whole thing so that you'll be able to recognize it again the next time you see it. All right, so the Department of Defense also has some separation incentives. Sometimes we have too many people As you can see, the Department of Defense, we spend a lot of money. That's a lot of expenses. So sometimes we have too many individuals, whether it's in the military or in the DOD itself. So we have to give people incentives to go work on the civilian side. So they either can have the buyout program or voluntary separation incentive or voluntary early retirement. So I can either buy you out and have you separate, give you a severance pay, or you can retire early. What are the conditions there with these separation incentives? Is the Department of Defense is limited to 25,000 buyout separations a year, 25,000. And as far as the buyout money, you get 40,000 or less, or the amount, okay, hold up. The lesser of 40,000 or the amount of the employee's severance pay. When I read that, what I hear is if I'm getting the lesser, which means the most I can get as a buyout is 40,000. So I'll read it again. Requires that buyout payments, the lesser of 40,000 or the amount of the employee's severance pay. So if your severance pay is 20,000, you're getting 20,000. If your severance pay is 50,000, you're getting 40,000. The limit you're going to get is 40,000. And if you accept a buyout, you have to sit out for 12 months. You accept the money, say, you know what, I don't want to do anything with the Department of Defense anymore. Give me my 40,000. I'm done with the Department of Defense. But then you decide, oh, I want to come back. Well, you got to wait a year based on separation incentives rule. All right, now we're going to focus on commercial activity. That's when we have a government function that we either keep in-house where we're doing it, another government employee doing the job, or it's a function where you can get a contractor to do the job. So those are called commercial activities. And so we looked at OMB Circular A76. And now I'm talking about circulars. When we talked about the budget, that is covered on the OMB Circular A11. So just like you have the GAO red, yellow, green book, red dealing with appropriation, for the budget, if you go to OMB Circular A11, it'll give you all the information you need about appropriations and the budget. Budget formulation, execution, all of that. But now we're dealing with OMB Circular A76. Let me drink some water. So you have to look at the functions that are commercial activity, contractor doing it, or inherently governmental, that only a government, a GS, a soldier, or a military person can do this function. So those are the two categories. There are two categories of inherently governmental, the act of governing and the monetary. So what you have to understand with the OMB circular is, let me go to the part on page 1221, is oftentimes you have to do a manpower study. If you're determining if something is being done by a government entity and we're trying to determine if it will best fit us to use a contract, which I see some of these scenarios where you have a lot of overhires on the government side working in an organization because you hired all these people when the wars kicked off. Well, now that we're downsizing with the wars and now you got all these overhires, well, those may be functions that may have to, those individuals may need to get jobs elsewhere so that your organization could then get a contractor to do the job. So you're not paying all these overhires and trying to find money every year to pay them. So if the government is doing the job, it is called the MEO, most efficient organization. That is the structure of the government that is able to do that function. And then you have a performance work statement that lists everything that contractor is going to need to do. And you submit a bid for bid so that you can see how much the contractor is going to charge or the contractors are going to charge to do that job. The idea is to remember is that whenever you start dealing with determining if you're going to cut civilian jobs or government jobs, you have to go to Congress. Congress has to be notified, and we're going to look at the number and when they have to be notified. So when Congress is notified in the beginning and then the next to last step. So before you even get ready to do the study, then Congress has to be notified that you're getting ready to do a manpower study. And so there's a process for that. So once you get approval for the study and the study starts, you do on the government side, you develop the MEO, the most efficient organization, see how much it costs the government to do it. And then the performance work statement is submitted to see how you get those cost bids and those invoices are received, those bids from the contractors, and then you compare the two to see which one is more cost efficient based on what you're looking for. And so oftentimes the contractor side must be at least 10% less than the government side for us to even consider, unless mission dictates, because if you need all your government employees to deploy and you have no choice, then you have to pay that increase anyway. And so when is Congress notified of a manpower study? Congress must be notified if you are addressing at least 46 or more civilian positions, and you're talking about people potentially losing their jobs, then Congress must be notified. So it says at least 5 working days before the congressional notification, you must also notify the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness. All right, so let's switch gears to a little fiscal law. So I might incorporate the module 1 with the 3.1 on these particular topics. All right, so can we accept gifts from outside sources? The answer is yes, but there are limits. If I have a contractor that works for the government, and oftentimes I see some of them, they bring the mouse pads, they have pens, calendars, little books, and we just kind of just take the gift. We don't think about it. But you need to consider it, especially if they're giving it to you personally. It's different if they just lay it, they come and then they just lay it in your area for everybody to get a copy. But once you accept that gift, the value of that one gift from that contractor must be $20 or less. And within a calendar year, I cannot accept a total of $50 from the same contractor. So that's the easy way to put that. So that's all I'm gonna say about gifts. From contractors, yes, $20 or less for one gift, and a total of all the values of all the gifts must not exceed $50 in a calendar year. Gifts between employees. I have a supervisor that's leaving, they're coming around collecting funds. I'm limited to donating. If I feel like it, I can donate no more than $10 for that individual's gift, because I don't want any issues. So let me flip here. People, disclosure. Oftentimes, if you're talking about switching to employment, if you are working for the government in a position where you're dealing with contractors and on particular contracts, it's frowned upon. You often have to wait about a year before you can then retire, get out the federal position, and then go work for that company. You got to be careful of then switching from the government and then automatically go working for a company that you directly was aligned with. So you know the government side, then you go over to the contractor side, it's often frowned upon. So you usually have to wait a year cooling off period. The topic is honoraria. Honoraria is compensation. I'm getting paid to do a lecture. I'm getting paid for a speech. Somebody invites me, a college, an organization invites me to come speak, and they want to pay me for my services to come. Can I accept the money? If I'm operating in my official capacity, it's because I work for the Army Reserve as a senior budget analyst or whatever. Whenever your title is used and you know it's your official capacity that they're inviting you, no, you cannot accept the funding, the money, the funds, because it looks like you're getting paid twice. You're getting paid from your regular job in your official capacity, and then you go to this organization and you're getting paid again. The only way you can accept, and that's why with me, if I'm doing anything like this, I'm going to the JAG folks, the legal folks, and I'm getting something in writing. I'm going to spell out exactly what I'm trying to do, and then I'm going to get a legal opinion to say, yep, you can do that. No, you cannot do that. Because if it's on a personal level, hey, you graduated from this university, we would like you to come back and give a speech or a lecture, then yes, you can accept payment. But I always, like I said, I recommend go to your ethics lawyer, get it in writing, get their approval before you do it, so you're not just operating. Because as soon as somebody's feelings get hurt and they start reporting you, then you have to explain and justify yourself. So it's best to do that. All right, what is risk management? Risk management is taking a look at your mission and what it is that you're trying to do, your process, and then determining what are the risks associated with that process, that step, that action. And you go the extra step of once you identify the risk, what else can I do now to mitigate the risk? So all part of that is done with your internal controls. Because you're doing your own checks and balances in-house, you'll be able to identify the risk and make corrections for the risk before you have an audit. So internal control is what you do, GAO Green Book. Auditing is an external organization coming in to look at your operation, GAO Yellow Book. All right, and so that's risk management. And we already talked about that. All right, so what are the GAO standards? So I'm gonna go, yeah. So if you go to the GAO Green Book, it'll go in depth into the GAO standards. Control the environment, actions you're putting in place, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring. Those are your GAO standards for internal control. And so in the study guide, they have several principles that fall under each one of those. And you need to read over. I recommend reading starting on page 1 through 20, 1 through 21, reading through each of those to know which one falls under control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, monitoring. Because most likely, if you see it again, it's going to be mixed up. It might give you number 14 and say, which GAO standards does this fall under? And then you got to pick from the multiple choice. And if you look through each one, you don't memorize the whole sentence. No, you pick out the keywords that ties it to control. And how I would do it, let's say the first one on page 1 through 20, control environment. The oversight body and management should demonstrate a commitment to integrity and ethical values. I would say the commander should demonstrate a commitment to, the commander should control the environment by demonstrating a commitment to integrity and ethical values. So I'm taking the GAO standard words and I'm putting them, inserting them into each one of those. It says the oversight body should oversee the entity's internal control system. Control environment oversees the internal control system. So when you do that and you put the GAO standard in the sentence and learn it that way you'll be able to pick out when you see it again, you're like, hey, that one I put with control or monitoring and so forth. So hopefully I was able to make that clear. So different categories of reporting internal control deficiencies. You talk about control deficiency, which is internal, and a significant deficiency, which is also internal. And of course, depending on what the particular issue is, will determine if it's significant enough to go from which category, from a plain control to a significant deficiency. And then you have the big one, which is a material weakness, which often is external because it's a big enough problem or risk that must be addressed with your hire. Because as financial managers, we deal with our operations, right, our processes. Then we have reporting information that we deal with. We got systems that we deal with. We want to make sure that we have controls in place to make sure that, okay, the GFIBS report that I'm sending out is accurate. Or is there an issue with it? So you have to have checks and balances in place that you can verify that it's pulling the right data. Because like they used to say back in the day, garbage in, garbage out. So if the individual put the wrong information in there, of course, it's going to put out the wrong information on the back end of it. And so you have to have steps in place to check your operation. How do we process these documents? What number are we putting in? How much, and so forth. And so material weakness can be in several areas, not just our systems, our operations. It could also be in the external reports that we submit. And so when it comes to internal control and these reports, a summary of your corrective action. If you're dealing with a material weakness, when you submit your annual report, we being the Department of Defense, they must include the agency financial report, the performance and accountability report, or some other management report. They need to identify the material weakness and what was done to correct it. What did they try to do to correct it? And if I want to find information at the DOD level dealing with internal control, I go to the DODI, DODI 5010.40. Now, still on material weakness. If material weakness is at the DOD level, there are 4 levels. It can either be a DOD level component, the major command, or at the installation level. It depends on how high it goes up. And so every organization must submit a statement of assurance each year. If you deal with internal control, you're probably familiar with this process. We do all these inspections throughout the year, and then at some point we have to submit up to our hire a statement of assurance. And the statement of assurance have 3 levels of assurance. Unmodified statement, that means I had no error. I didn't have to modify anything, so it's unmodified. Or a modified statement of assurance mean that we had at least 1 error or weakness, a material weakness, or a statement of no assurance. That means you got lots of problems and you can't fix none of them. So you have no assurance. And so you either, as dealing with risk, you have a risk profile versus what's the other one? Yep, I didn't say that one, so hold on. That's how my brain works, is once my mind remembers, I can't rest, so I have to go back and find it. So at this point, I'll pause if there's any questions. Ms. T, I don't see your hand, so we'll drive on. Risk
You're
profile.
Fine, You're fine.
You're good?
Go ahead.
Okay.
I'm following.
I have to remember you're there. It's like, okay, sorry. All right, so risk profile. The primary purpose of risk profile is to provide analysis of the risk that an agency faces. So the risk profile identifies all your major risks. The risk register is what I was trying to remember because they don't have it on the slide. Nope, they sure don't. The risk register just have a list of all the inventory of all the risks you may have faced. And so the risk profile is the key one, which lists all the material weaknesses that you have faced. All right. All right, so now I'm going to jump back to fiscal law and cover some of those areas. So it goes quicker once you get through the material and the pain of going page by page. And then once you start going through it, where you actually start focusing on the material, then you'll see you get to the point where you can flip the pages and kind of regurgitate like I'm doing. And so with the fiscal law, we've gone over a lot of these. We talked about when you receive public funds, having fiduciary certifiers or fiduciary responsibility versus pecuniary responsibility. I associate fiduciary, even if you don't know what the word means, the F in front of it associates with using the right fund, appropriated fund. And then the pecuniary sounds like punishment to me. So I associate punishment with pecuniary because the pecuniary goes with the certifiers that actually certify the money going out, the disbursement of those funds. So the people that actually releases the cash, they are on the hook to pay that money back much quicker than the one that's, oh, we use the right O&M versus procurement money, those guys. All right, so we talked about in fiscal law, purpose, time, and amount. Every appropriation has a specific purpose. We have them for new obligations for a specific time frame and for a specific amount. Whatever the amount is, that's all we can spend. We can't spend before we get it, and we cannot spend more than what we receive. So purpose is covered in 31 U.S. Code 1301. Amount is 1502 and no, time is 1502 and amount is 1341, 1342, and 1517. And what you just saw there is because I learned them in one order all the time, whenever I go out of sequence, my brain automatically is like, hey, what you doing? So lesson learned there. So purpose is 1301. Time is 31 U.S. Code. So that means if you want to read about purposes, statute, punishment under the ADA violations that we always talk about, 31 U.S. Code, Chapter 13, Paragraph 1, 1301. That's how I understand. Because all appropriations, when it comes to availability, either annual appropriation, multi-year, or no year. They don't expire, but they still got rules that they have to follow. So under 1301, it's saying that if I spend money for a particular purpose, I need to make sure that whatever I'm buying falls under that purpose. If I know I'm building a $20 million building, I cannot use O&M money to buy that because I have to use military construction money to do that. Purpose. Specific purpose, general purposes. Specific, if it's listed in the law, authorization, appropriation, comptroller general's rules, or general. We're going TDY. Use, okay, general, travel. When you use purpose and you're trying to figure out which appropriation to use, you apply the necessary expense doctrine. You say, what is this that I'm trying to buy bear a logical relationship to the appropriation? Yes. Is this what I'm trying to buy prohibited by law? Did they already say you can't buy it? Or is it funded elsewhere? Am I trying to get a contract for something that I can go into the supply system and buy? I just don't want to wait because we're in that microwave environment where I want it now. So, hey, why don't I just do a contract? Why don't I just use a GPC card, government purchase card, even though that item can be provided in the supply system? So is it provided elsewhere? So those are the 3-part test for when you talk about purpose and the necessary expense doctrine. Then you switch to time. 31 U.S. Code 1502. Every appropriation has a specific time and when you can obligate the funds, when you can spend it, or when you have to wait until Congress gives you new funding. So bona fide need basically says current appropriation is used to pay current year bills. And everything else that comes out of that pocket becomes an exception to the policy that you always got to get approval for. When you're talking about timeline, is you have to apply and look at what is it that you're trying to buy. Is it a service? And if it is it a severable service or a non-severable service? And what I stated about these two is non-severable is easy. It's one of those where if I'm going to do that mission, I have to do the complete mission. So that means I can obligate the full amount of the money today, even if it's going to take a year to get the job done. I can use the full amount of the money to obligate for that job. Non-severable. I can't break the job up and get a benefit. A severable service, on the other hand, is something that, like a cleaning service, I can end that contract. People that come and pick up your garbage or whatever it is. Severable means, but if I have to end the contract, I still would have previously received a benefit for that. And so severable, now you have to look at timeline. You can only obligate up to 12 months of that contract. If it's June and I'm going into a 12-month contract and it's a severable service, I can spend all of the money for that current fiscal year for that whole 12 months. I obligate the full 12 months. But if in the contract verbiage, it says this is a severable service, but it's a 15-month contract, I got to read the contract to see how much money I can actually give the contracting officer, the KO, to do that contract. If it's a 15-month severable service contract, then I can only obligate up to 12 months of current appropriation, regardless if it crosses fiscal year. And then the additional 13, 14, 15 month must stay subject to availability of funds because Congress hasn't appropriated the funds yet. But if Congress appropriated the funds, I got you, Ms. Tina. If Congress had already appropriated the funds for the next fiscal year, then I could get the funding line for the new fiscal year and put it on the second line. So the first line will be 12 months or less. I use current appropriation, and then I can cite the line for the new appropriation only if Congress had already appropriated the funds. All right, go ahead, Ms. Tina.
Never mind, you answered my question. When you described it that way, I had to visually look at how everything was set up. And because yes, that would be correct on a 15-month contract that you would use funds that have been approved or CR, depending.
Correct. But the CR, right? What's the difference with the CR though? Let's say with the same example, it's 15 months, but Congress had not appropriated the funds. They have a CR, but they didn't appropriate the funds early, like before October. So what do you do then?
So in that particular case, you would use the CR for the current year. Wait a minute.
Think about it. So you already have appropriation. Let's make it even. Fiscal year 23, we already have our FY23 funds, right?
Yes.
And so we're talking about if it's going to be a 15-month contract starting today, it's going to cross over into FY24. But based on what I stated, I can take current money that's already approved, 12 months or less, I can pay with current money.
Money. It's the month 13 through 15, you would use the CR for to continue the process. So that way there's not a work stoppage. Or am I still saying this wrong?
Not quite right. Because
Okay.
under a CR, you don't have an actual appropriation. So you cannot cite it on a contract. You'll say subject to availability of funds.
Availability.
So remember, there were two
Okay.
permissible actions on page 3120. Either Congress had already appropriated and you have it, or a CR. So oftentimes, if you're operating under a CR, even if it's a recurring contract, because it's a severable contract, most contracting office, they will not cite the CR line of accounting. Let me put it
Okay,
out.
you said it right there, service contract. Okay.
Right, because it's a service.
Okay. Okay.
So that's why I want to leave it there. It's a severable service contract. So most of them are not going to cite the CR money to do it.
Okay.
They're going to say subject, for they'll give you the line of accounting for the current year for the 12 months, and then they'll say subject to availability of funds. And the reason you want to do that, because then Congress might come back and lower the money they give you.
Yeah.
And you might not need the other extra 3 months.
Yeah, no, you're right. When you said a service contract, it was like, okay, I missed it when you said it the first time, but when you said it just a few seconds ago, it's like, okay, never mind. I'm asking the wrong question. So
Okay,
take
no
that
problem.
part of the recording now.
No, it's good, because other people think that same way too. And it's just being able to, that's why and I know it's different when you actually just listening versus looking at something.
Yeah.
But that's what it is you got to be able to hear all the key words of what am I dealing with, and why wouldn't I use a CR to just obligate the funds for that contract. With severable meanings, I can end it if I don't need it. So I would not tie up my CR funds for a severable service that I know I may or may not need.
And that makes perfect sense, the way you just described that. Okay, thank you, Ms.
Okay,
Allen.
yes, ma'am. Where we at? We got 10 minutes. All right, so we still good. So with appropriations, certain appropriations are annual, as mentioned, or expense type, or multi-year, which are investment types. So you need to know the differences. Military personnel, MILPERS, and O&M are annual 1-year appropriations. RDT&E 2-year, procurement 3, shipbuilding, conversion, Navy, and military construction are 5-year appropriations. What does that mean? They are investment type. It means that once you receive those appropriations, they are good for new obligations for those timeframes. And so that's when I led into the phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 of an appropriation life cycle. When they're in the phase 1, which are those years that I just listed, you can get new contracts, can be populated. Once the enters phase 2, the expire state, the only thing you can do with those appropriations is make adjustments, either upward or downward, close out things, add additional funding to it. And remember that all appropriation stays in the expired state for an additional 5 years. So even if it's a construction, it's good for 5 in phase 1, and phase 2, it stays for an additional 5. Then once that expired state is up, it gets into the closed state. All appropriations are returned to the miscellaneous receipts account in the Treasury once that funding enters the closed state. Like this year, we're closing out FY18. So come 1 October of this year, 2023, FY18 funds, whatever's left, is going to be wiped and pulled into the back to the Treasury. However, if you do receive a bill from an account that you can see, oh, this MIPR was FY18, but oh, we don't have any FY18 funds. What it's saying, exception says you can use up to 1% of current funds to pay for that invoice if it's a small amount, or you have to direct them to DFAS to get their money because that contractor is still going to get paid. And remember with this section, the next time you see it, it's not going to be in this format. It's most likely going to tell you what today's date is, what the appropriation you're dealing with. So you got to know if I'm dealing with RDT&E, that's a 2-year appropriation. And if they say, when are these funds closed? Then you got to be able to, okay, well, it's expired for an additional 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then the 6th year, then it's closed. That's the fiscal year. So make sure you look over that area. So we talked about that. Budget authority. And then amount goes into the 31 US Code 1341, 1342, 1517. 1341 says I cannot spend more or in advance of receiving my appropriation. 1342 says I cannot accept voluntary services for a position that is legally supposed to be paid unless it's an agency or organization that already has statutory authority to accept volunteers. So 1342 deals with volunteers, and 1517 on the amount deals with apportionment. Going back to OMB apportions, so between all the agencies that gets apportioned funds, they can violate 1517. Because Congress appropriates, OMB apportions, DOD issues allotments, we commit, we obligate, and we outlay funds, take the funds from the Treasury. And so once we're using these funds, if we identify an ADA violation, we must notify our hire within 2 weeks of identifying that violation. And then 4 months after that initial finding, we have to complete our preliminary review. We talked about all of this already, government shutdowns. All right, and we talked about a little bit about the Feed and Forage Act, because this is the only time on that chart where it's listed on page 3153. 41 U.S. Code 6301, Feed and Forage Act is a law that authorizes the Department of Defense to spend once they deployed in an area. And they have to buy money for things that they have to have, and they don't have enough funding to do it at that point. They can spend more than what they have. If it's something to do with medical supplies, they need clothing because they go to a place that's freezing and they don't have the right gear and they have to buy gear from there. So under the Feed and Forage Act, it authorizes the DOD to spend more than what they have. So this is an exception to the normal spending more than you have. And we talked about the Treasury warrants. Okay. And we got 4 minutes to spare. All right. I think I got this down packed now. All right. So I have 12:56, which we got about 4 more minutes. So I'll open it up if Ms. Tina, if you have any more questions at this point that would be beneficial on anything we've covered. And then next week, what I'll do is I'll go, instead of the book, then I'm going to go to the actual notes that I have and question answers. I think I got a few feedback from some people on some areas that I may need to point out. So I'm going to go back and look at those and make sure that I cover those. The biggest thing I want to, before I leave, is making sure that people understand the study guide is not the only material for the CDFM study group. I'm not going to say it is because it's not. However, if you learn the ins and outs of the things that I've been pointing out to you, yes, you can pass the CDFM exam without having to pull every single regulation and law that's listed in the book. But you cannot just skim. You cannot just only learn it the verbiage word for word in here. You have to understand the concept of what's going on. And like I said, building a process map, a blank sheet of paper, and okay, what's going on from the budget formulation, budget execution, congressional action, what's happening with Congress. Then once he give it to the president, what's the president doing with it? And then, oh, by the way, when I'm dealing with the budget comes this way first from the president to Congress. Then Congress send it back and is like, you got to be able to break that piece out so that you then know who works for whom, who's on what hierarchy. And then once you decipher all of that, then you'll be able to understand the information better. All right, if I see no questions, if you have any particular questions that come up once you look at the videos, leave a comment, because I like people to click like, click share, leave a comment, because again, more activity on our YouTube page is what triggers YouTube to promote the videos, because they're like, oh, there's a lot of people touching these videos. Let me go over here and support and push these videos out so more people can find them. So if you have not already subscribed to our YouTube page, please go ahead and subscribe. Next week, I will go through again with another review, but I'm going to do it from a different angle, going over the same information. And likewise, you should be doing the same thing as you're studying. You don't want to study the same way all the time, because when you look at information from a different angle, it's easier for you to then get on an exam and be able to like, okay, see it from different angles. So, all right, this is Helen Thomas and the CDFM study group. I'll see you guys again next time. Thank you for stopping by. You have a great day, Miss Tina.
You too, Miss Helen. Thank you very much. The information was good as always. Thank you very
much. All right, you're
much.
welcome.
See you next week.
All right, see you next week. Let's stop the recording.